The telegram arrived at 11:47 a.m. on September 14, 1906, and was filed without comment in the expedition ledger kept by Dr. Harold Moss, surgeon and second-in-command of the Whitney Geological Survey Party, then camped along the upper Clearwater River in northern Idaho. The message, routed through 3 relay stations from Lewiston, advised that barometric readings suggested unsettled weather approaching from the northwest. It recommended the party consider descending to the railroad camp at Elk Creek, approximately 18 miles southwest, within 48 hours. Dr. Moss read the telegram aloud to the group during their midday meal. Several men looked up at the cloudless sky. Someone made a joke about desk-bound meteorologists. The telegram was placed in the document case, and the meal continued. The Whitney survey consisted of 11 men. The expedition leader, Professor Edmund Whitney of Columbia University, Dr. Moss, 2 graduate assistants, Paul Hendricks and Thomas Wyeth, 4 hired guides and packers from Orofino, 2 camp assistants, and a photographer, Mr. Lewis Gardner, whose glass plates would later provide the only visual record of the group's final week. They had been in the upper Clearwater Basin for 19 days, conducting stratigraphic analysis of exposed Precambrian formations along the canyon walls. Their permit allowed them to remain in the field until October 1st. The weather had been exceptional, dry, clear, temperatures in the low 70s during the day. Professor Whitney's correspondence from this period, preserved in the Columbia University archives, expresses satisfaction with progress and mentions his intention to extend the survey northward toward the Bitterroot Divide if conditions remained favorable. The party's camp was situated on a broad terrace above the river, sheltered by ponderosa pine and accessible by a pack trail that connected, after 2 days' travel, to the logging road at Elk Creek. The site had been chosen for its proximity to the geological formations under study and for its defensible position, high enough to avoid spring flooding, close enough to water with good sight lines in all directions. It was, by the standards of early 20th century field science, a model encampment. The tents were well staked, the supplies were adequate, the men were experienced. There was no reason on the morning of September 14th to imagine that within 72 hours the camp would be completely inaccessible, or that the carefully annotated field notes stacked in Professor Whitney's tent would remain unread for 11 months. What the telegram did not specify, and what Professor Whitney could not have known, was that the unsettled weather, described in Lewiston's advisory, was already moving faster than the forecast models suggested. A deep low-pressure system, drawn down from the Gulf of Alaska, was accelerating as it crossed the Cascades. By the time Dr. Moss read the telegram aloud, the leading edge of the storm was less than 90 miles away, but the sky above the Clearwater remained blue. The aspens along the ridgeline shivered in a light breeze. The river ran clear and low, exposing gravel bars that hadn't been visible in weeks. Professor Whitney's journal entry for September 14th, written that evening by lantern light, contains a single reference to the telegram. He notes that the weather advisory gave us pause, but that after consultation with the senior packer, a man named Benjamin Crail, the decision was made to remain in place. Crail, who had guided parties through the Clearwater country for 15 years, reportedly told Whitney that early-season storms in the region typically brought rain, not snow, and that even if snow fell at higher elevations, the pack trail would remain passable for at least a week. Whitney accepted this assessment. In his journal he writes, "We are not so far committed that we cannot withdraw if necessary, but the formations here are remarkable, and another 3 or 4 days may yield significant results. The men are in good spirits. We have provisions enough. There is time." It is this phrase, "there is time," that appears most frequently in the documents recovered from the Whitney camp. It appears in letters written that week and never sent. It appears in Dr. Moss's medical log in a note about postponing a scheduled resupply. It appears in the margin of one of Thomas Wyeth's sketches beside a drawing of the canyon wall. The assumption was universal and reasonable. The party had maps, experience, and a clear route of egress. The calendar read mid-September. The nearest settlement was 2 days away by foot, less if they traveled light. They had come to study rock, and the rock would not wait. But neither was there any urgency to abandon a productive site on the basis of a single telegram. At 6:20 p.m., as the last light faded from the canyon, Lewis Gardner set up his camera on the south edge of camp and exposed a plate showing the group gathered near the cook fire. The image, now housed in the Idaho State Historical Society, shows 11 men in various attitudes of rest. Some seated on logs, some standing with tin cups. One, Paul Hendricks, leaning against a pine with a book open in his lap. Professor Whitney sits at the center, his field jacket unbuttoned, his face turned slightly away from the lens. The exposure required several seconds, and so the figures are blurred at the edges, softened by small movements. But the scene itself is legible. A functioning camp, orderly and calm, with no indication that anything was wrong. What the photograph does not show is that the wind had shifted. Benjamin Crale mentioned it to Dr. Moss just after the image was taken. The breeze, which had been from the south all day, was now coming from the northwest, and it carried a different smell, something damp and electric. Crale said he didn't like it. Dr. Moss asked if they should break camp. Crale considered this, then shook his head. "Morning," he said. "We'll see in the morning." Dr. Moss agreed. The decision was noted in his log with a single line. "Packer advises weather watch. Will assess conditions at first light." The fire was banked at 9 o'clock. The men retired to their tents. Professor Whitney wrote 3 more pages in his journal, mostly technical observations about the stratigraphy of the South Canyon wall. His final entry for September 14th reads, "A productive day. If the weather holds, we may complete the section work by the 18th and return with a full data set. The delay, if it comes, will be brief." By midnight, the temperature had dropped 11 degrees. The wind in the pines had grown steady and low, and on the high ridges to the northwest, where no one from the Whitney party could see, the first snow had already begun to fall. The archived meteorological data from Lewiston, examined decades later, shows that the storm's forward speed increased by nearly 40% during the night of September 14th. A handwritten note in the margin of the Lewiston weather log, added by the supervising meteorologist on the morning of the 15th, reads, "Revision. System moving faster than anticipated. High elevation snow likely by evening. Recommend immediate advisory upgrade." But there was no mechanism for a second telegram. The relay stations were not staffed at night, and even if a message had been sent, it would not have reached the Whitney camp, which had no receiving equipment and depended entirely on prearranged supply drops for communication with the outside world. At dawn on September 15th, the sky was still clear. Professor Whitney emerged from his tent, looked north toward the divide, and saw nothing that concerned him. The record shows that the party ate breakfast, conducted morning ablutions, and by 8 a.m. had divided into work groups as usual. Whitney, Moss, and Hendricks descended to the canyon floor to continue mapping. Wyeth and Gardner remained in camp to process photographic plates. The packers began an inventory of the remaining provisions. No one suggested leaving. The last opportunity to evacuate the camp with full equipment and supplies occurred, by most reconstructions, sometime before noon on September 15th. After that point, the narrowing window of safe travel would have required the party to abandon non-essential gear, move quickly, and hope that the storm's leading edge did not overtake them on the trail. But at noon, the sky was still blue, the wind was moderate, the river was quiet. And the shared assumption, documented in 3 separate journals from that day, was that even if the weather worsened, they had time. They could leave that evening or the next morning and still reach Elk Creek ahead of any serious snowfall. The archives contain a letter written by Paul Hendricks on the afternoon of September 15th, intended for his fiancée in New York. He describes the landscape, the quality of the light, the satisfaction of the work. Near the end, he writes, "There has been talk of a storm, but it feels far away, and we are not worried. The professor is cautious. If there were real danger, we would know. We would go. But the signs are not there yet, and the work is too important to abandon on a guess. By 4 p.m., the first clouds had appeared over the northwest ridge, high, thin cirrus that caught the afternoon sun and turned pale gold. Dr. Moss noted them in his log and showed them to Benjamin Crale. Crale studied the sky for several minutes, then said, "We should pack." Dr. Moss brought the observation to Professor Whitney, who was still at the canyon floor. Whitney looked up, looked at the clouds, and agreed that they should prepare to leave. But he did not say now. He said, soon. The distinction, in hindsight, was everything. The group returned to camp just before dark. A meeting was held. Whitney proposed that they strike the tents at first light and begin the descent to Elk Creek, traveling in 2 groups to move faster. The plan was accepted without objection. The cook fire was built up, supper was prepared, tools were cleaned and stowed. By 9 p.m., most of the men had retired, expecting to wake early and be on the trail by sunrise. At 10:15 p.m., the wind increased. At 10:40, the temperature dropped sharply. At 11:03, according to the chronometer later recovered from Dr. Moss's tent, the first snow began to fall. It was light at first, flakes small and dry, visible only in the glow of the dying fire. Within 20 minutes it was heavier. Within an hour, it was a whiteout. By dawn on September 16th, 14 inches of snow had fallen, and the storm showed no sign of slowing. The pack trail was gone. The route to Elk Creek was impassable. And the men of the Whitney Geological Survey, who had believed there was time, found themselves stranded in a place from which there was now no safe way out. The last notation in Professor Whitney's journal, dated September 15th and written hours before the snow began, reads simply, "Tomorrow we leave. The work is done." The decision to remain in the Clearwater Basin on September 14th was not reckless. It was not even unusual. Field parties of the period routinely extended their stay in remote locations when conditions appeared favorable, and the protocols for weather-related evacuation were informal, based more on the judgment of experienced guides than on any systematic risk assessment. The Whitney survey had followed standard procedure. They had received an advisory, consulted with their senior packer, and made a collective decision to continue work while monitoring the situation. In the context of early 20th century scientific expeditions, this was considered prudent behavior. The problem was not that the men acted irresponsibly. The problem was that their experience, their training, and their reasonable assumptions about the natural world all pointed them toward a conclusion that was, in this particular case, wrong. Professor Whitney had led or participated in 17 prior field expeditions, including surveys in the Rocky Mountains, the Sierra Nevada, and the Alaskan interior. He was 52 years old, a full professor with tenure, the author of 2 well-regarded monographs on stratigraphic geology, and a member in good standing of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. His reputation was built on careful planning and conservative decision-making. Colleagues described him as methodical, even cautious. He did not take unnecessary risks. He did not push his men beyond reasonable limits. The Whitney Survey's operational plan, filed with Columbia University in July 1906, included detailed contingency protocols for equipment failure, injury, and adverse weather. The plan specified that in the event of a major storm, the party would withdraw to the nearest point of resupply and await improved conditions. Whitney had written these protocols himself. He believed in them. And on the evening of September 14th, he did not believe the protocols had been triggered. The meteorological advisory from Lewiston was ambiguous in key respects. It mentioned unsettled weather but did not specify snow. It recommended evacuation within 48 hours, which implied that immediate departure was not necessary. And it was based on barometric data from a station more than 100 miles away, in a different drainage, at a much lower elevation. Benjamin Crale, the senior packer, had seen dozens of September storms in the Clearwater country, and in his experience, early season precipitation at that elevation typically fell as rain. Snow was possible at the highest ridges, but not in the canyon itself, and not in quantities that would block the trails. When Dr. Moss asked Crale directly whether the party was in danger, Crale's answer was no. Not if they kept watch and left at the first sign of deterioration. This was sound advice, rooted in 15 years of local knowledge. It was also, in this instance, incorrect. The group's collective sense of security was reinforced by the environmental cues available to them on September 14th and 15th. The sky was clear. The river was low and calm, indicating no recent precipitation in the upper basin. The ground was dry. The aspens had not yet turned, suggesting that hard frosts were still weeks away. Birds were active. Insects were abundant. Every observable indicator pointed toward stable late summer weather. The men were not ignoring danger signs. There were no danger signs to ignore. The storm that eventually trapped them was anomalous, fast-moving, and unseasonably severe. It was the kind of weather event that occurs in that region, perhaps once in a decade, and it gave almost no advance warning. The cultural context of the expedition also played a role. The men of the Whitney Survey were products of the Progressive Era, a period characterized by confidence in human mastery over nature, faith in scientific expertise, and a general belief that careful planning could mitigate most risks. They carried maps, compasses, and instruments. They had studied the terrain. They had provisions, medical supplies, and a clear route of egress. The idea that they might be caught off guard by something as mundane as a snowstorm, something they had anticipated and prepared for, seemed implausible. They were not adventurers seeking thrills. They were professionals conducting a survey under controlled conditions. The assumption, never stated but deeply felt, was that they were too well prepared to be surprised. Dr. Moss's medical log from September 14th and 15th provides a window into the group's psychological state during the critical period. He records no injuries, no illnesses, and no complaints of fatigue or low morale. The entries are brief and routine. Vaccinations checked, blisters treated, one case of mild indigestion resolved with bicarbonate. On the evening of September 15th, hours before the snow began, Moss writes, "Men in excellent condition, spirits high, no medical concerns. Weather advisory noted, but group consensus is to depart tomorrow morning. No immediate risk perceived." The phrase, "no immediate risk perceived," appears frequently in post-expedition analyses and became, in later years, a kind of shorthand for the psychological trap that ensnared the Whitney party. The men were capable of perceiving risk. They were not naive or foolish, but the risk they perceived was abstract and future-oriented, something that might develop over the next several days if conditions worsened. What they failed to grasp was that the risk was not future-oriented at all. It was present, accelerating, and would arrive far faster than any of their models suggested. But models are built on past experience, and their past experience told them that September storms in northern Idaho were manageable. They had no data point for what was coming. Thomas Wyeth, one of the graduate assistants, kept a detailed personal journal throughout the expedition. His entries from mid-September are relaxed, even cheerful. On September 13th, he writes about the quality of the geological exposures and his hope that the data would support his thesis work. On September 14th, he mentions the telegram, but dismisses it as the usual cautionary noise from town. On September 15th, his entry is brief. "Packing tomorrow. Ashamed to leave. This is the best site we've found. But Whitney's right to be careful. We'll be in Elk Creek by the 17th and back in the field by October if the weather holds." Wyeth's optimism was not unusual. The entire group shared a belief that their timeline was flexible, that they had margin for error, and that even if they misjudged the weather, the consequences would be inconvenient rather than catastrophic. This belief was rooted in the fact that they had supplies for several weeks, that the camp was secure, and that help, in the form of the resupply team scheduled to arrive at Elk Creek on September 20th, was only days away. What they did not account for was that the resupply team would be unable to reach them, that the trails would become impassable, and that several weeks of supplies would prove insufficient for the wait that followed. The archaeological record from the Whitney camp, examined during the recovery effort in the summer of 1907, shows no evidence of panic or disorganization during the final days before the storm. The tents were properly staked. The supplies were inventoried and stored according to protocol. Tools were cleaned and packed. Lewis Gardner's photographic equipment was wrapped and crated with care. The camp had the appearance of a group preparing for an orderly departure, not a group fleeing from danger. In one of the tents, investigators found a half-finished letter from Paul Hendricks to his fiancée, dated September 15th. The letter breaks off mid-sentence, as though Hendricks intended to finish it the next morning before leaving. The sentence reads, "We will be out of the mountains soon, and I will wire you from Lewiston. There is no cause for—" The letter was found on a folding table, weighted down by a stone. The ink had not dried when the snow began to fall. Benjamin Crale's judgment, which proved so consequential, was based on a lifetime of experience in the northern Rockies. He had worked as a packer since the age of 17, had survived blizzards, floods, and fires, and was regarded by the outfitting companies in Orofino as one of the most reliable guides in the region. His decision to remain in camp on September 14th was not a failure of expertise. It was expertise encountering an outlier. Crale believed, based on every storm he had seen in 15 years, that the party had at least 2 days' notice before conditions became dangerous. He was accustomed to a world in which weather systems moved predictably, gave clear signals, and allowed time for response. The storm that struck the Clearwater Basin on the night of September 15th moved twice as fast as any storm in the regional record. It carried moisture content far above normal for the season, and it dropped snow at an elevation where snow, in mid-September, was virtually unknown. Crale's final note, written in pencil on a scrap of paper and recovered from his coat pocket, is undated but believed to have been composed on the morning of September 16th, after the snow had made evacuation impossible. It reads, "Misjudged. Should have left on the 14th. My fault. The note was never sent." Crale survived the ordeal, was one of the 6 men eventually rescued, and refused to speak publicly about the expedition for the rest of his life. The illusion of time, the belief that there were hours or days available for deliberation, was not a product of laziness or indifference. It was a product of pattern recognition in a world where the patterns had, for a brief and critical moment, broken down. The men of the Whitney survey did what experienced people do. They assessed the situation, consulted the best available information, and made a decision that balanced risk against reward. They did not know, and had no way to know, that the information was wrong, that the patterns were shifting, and that the margin they believed they had was already gone. On the evening of September 15th, just before supper, Professor Whitney stood at the edge of camp and looked northwest toward the Bitterroot Divide. The sun was setting. The sky was streaked with high clouds that glowed orange and pink. One of the packers, a young man named Samuel Pruitt, stood beside him. According to Pruitt's later testimony, Whitney said, "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Pruitt agreed. Whitney continued, "If this were April, I'd be worried. But it's September. We'll be fine." Pruitt nodded. Neither man spoke again. They stood together for several minutes, watching the light fade, and then returned to the fire. Less than 6 hours later, the snow began. The first indication that something was wrong came not from the weather, but from the animals. At approximately 10 p.m., on September 15th, the pack mules, tethered in a clearing 30 yards northeast of the main camp, became restless. The camp assistant responsible for the stock, a man named Robert Duval, was roused from his tent by the sound of hooves shifting on rocky ground and the low, anxious grunting that mules make when disturbed. Duval emerged into the darkness, carrying a lantern, and found the animals pulling against their tethers, ears back, eyes wide. He checked the perimeter for predators, found none, and returned to his tent. He mentioned the incident to no one. The mules settled after 20 minutes, and Duval went back to sleep. At 10:40 p.m., the wind shifted again, this time abruptly, swinging from southwest to northwest in the span of a few minutes. The temperature, which had been in the low 50s during the evening, dropped into the upper 30s. Dr. Moss, who was still awake and writing by lantern light in his tent, noted the change. He extinguished the lantern stepped outside and stood in the clearing for several minutes, listening. The wind had a different quality now, steady, cold, and carrying a faint hiss that he associated with precipitation at higher elevations. He considered waking Professor Whitney, but decided against it. The decision to leave had already been made. They would depart at first light. A few hours would make no difference. By 11 p.m., most of the camp was asleep. Lewis Gardner, who kept irregular hours due to his work with the photographic plates, was still moving between the supply tent and his own shelter. He noticed the wind, noticed the temperature, and noticed something else. A smell in the air, clean and metallic, that reminded him of winter in Vermont. He paused, looked up at the sky, and saw that the stars had disappeared. Clouds had moved in, low, dense, and moving fast. Gardner stood for a moment uncertain, then decided it was not his responsibility to raise an alarm. He was a photographer, not a guide. If the weather were truly dangerous, the packers would know. He went to his tent and laced the flap shut. The snow began at 11:03 p.m., according to the chronometer recovered from Dr. Moss's tent. The chronometer, a Swiss-made pocket watch, had stopped at 6:22 a.m. On September 18th, the moment, investigators believe, when the tent collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow and the watch fell into a drift. But the watch was wound daily, and its log shows continuous operation until that point, allowing for a reasonably precise reconstruction of the timeline. At 11:03 p.m. on September 15th, the first flakes began to fall. They were small, dry, and crystalline, the kind of snow that falls from very cold air. Within 15 minutes, the flakes had grown larger and wetter. Within 30 minutes, the snowfall was steady and visible even in the darkness. Within an hour, it was heavy enough to wake several members of the expedition. Paul Hendricks was the first to fully register what was happening. He woke at 11:47 p.m., disturbed by the sound of snow sliding off the roof of his tent. He opened the flap and saw, in the faint glow of the banked campfire, a world transformed. The ground was already covered, perhaps 2 inches, and the air was thick with falling snow. Hendricks dressed, pulled on his boots, and walked to Professor Whitney's tent. He called softly through the canvas. Whitney emerged, groggy and disoriented, and stood beside Hendricks in the snow. They looked at each other, then looked at the sky. Neither spoke for several seconds. The conversation that followed was reconstructed from Hendricks' later testimony and from a fragmentary entry in Whitney's journal, written days afterward. Whitney's first reaction was not alarm but irritation. He had hoped for one more day of work, and now that was impossible. His second reaction was calculation. He asked Hendricks how much snow had fallen. Hendricks estimated 2 or 3 inches. Whitney asked if the trail was still passable. Hendricks said he didn't know but assumed it would be, at least for a few more hours. Whitney nodded, then said, "We'll assess at first light. If it's still falling, we leave immediately." Hendricks agreed. The 2 men stood in the snow for another minute, watching it accumulate, then returned to their tents. The decision to wait for first light, to defer action for another 6 hours, was the last point at which the group's fate might have changed. If Whitney had roused the camp immediately, if they had abandoned the tents and most of the equipment, if they had begun hiking southwest by midnight with lanterns and minimal gear, they might have reached the lower elevations before the snow became impassable. The trail at that point was still distinguishable. The temperature was above freezing at lower elevations, and the storm, though intensifying, had not yet sealed off the route. But the idea of a midnight evacuation, in darkness, in falling snow, with 11 men and all their equipment, seemed more dangerous than waiting a few hours for visibility. Whitney made the choice that seemed reasonable. He chose caution over haste, and in doing so, he committed the party to the camp. By 1 a.m., the snow was falling heavily enough to obscure the nearest trees. The depth on the ground had reached 5 or 6 inches. The wind had increased, driving the snow horizontally at times and creating small drifts against the tents. Benjamin Crail, who had also woken and gone outside, found Professor Whitney standing near the cold remains of the campfire. The 2 men conferred. Crail's assessment was blunt. If the snow continued at this rate, the trail would be gone by morning. Whitney asked if they should leave now. Crail hesitated, then shook his head. He said that moving in the dark, in a whiteout, with no visibility and no certain knowledge of the trail's condition, was likely to result in someone getting lost or injured. Better to wait for dawn, he said, and then move fast. Whitney accepted this. The decision was made. They would leave at first light, no delays, no exceptions. But first light, when it came, brought no relief. By dawn on September 16th, the snow had been falling for more than 7 hours. The depth in the clearing was 14 inches. The trees were bowed under the weight. The sky was a uniform gray, and the snow showed no sign of stopping. Professor Whitney emerged from his tent at 6:10 a.m. and immediately understood that the situation had changed fundamentally. The trail, visible the night before as a faint depression winding through the trees, was gone, buried under a blanket of white. The landmarks they had relied on for navigation were obscured. The temperature had dropped further, and the snow was now mixed with sleet, turning the surface into a slick, treacherous crust. A meeting was called. All 11 men gathered in the clearing, standing in snow that reached past their ankles. Whitney outlined the situation. The trail was impassable, visibility was near zero, and attempting to navigate 18 miles through mountainous terrain in these conditions would almost certainly result in the party becoming separated or lost. The alternative was to remain in place, wait for the storm to pass, and then descend as quickly as possible once conditions improved. He asked for opinions. Dr. Moss supported waiting. Thomas Wyeth suggested attempting a partial evacuation, sending the fittest men ahead to bring help. Benjamin Crail pointed out that anyone leaving the camp in these conditions would have no way to navigate and would likely die of exposure before reaching Elk Creek. The conversation continued for 15 minutes. No consensus emerged. Finally, Whitney made the decision. They would stay. The rationale was this. The camp was secure, the tents were holding, and they had supplies for several weeks. The storm could not last forever. September blizzards in the region typically cleared within 24 to 48 hours. Once the snow stopped, they could dig out the trail, or at worst, wait for the snow to consolidate and then hike out on the surface. Help was expected at Elk Creek on September 20th. If the party did not arrive, the resupply team would know something was wrong and would send word to Orofino. A search would be organized, the party would be found. The logic was sound, and it was supported by every member of the group except one. Lewis Gardner, the photographer, argued for attempting an immediate evacuation. He pointed out that waiting meant trusting the weather to improve, and that the weather had already proven unpredictable. He said that staying in place was a gamble, and that the odds would worsen with every hour that passed. His argument was noted but not adopted. Whitney thanked him for his input, then ended the meeting. The decision was made. They would stay in camp and wait for the storm to pass. The snow continued to fall throughout September 16th. By mid-afternoon, the depth had reached 22 inches. The temperature hovered in the low 20s. The wind gusted to 30 miles per hour, creating drifts that reached 4 feet in places. The men worked in shifts to keep the tents from collapsing, shoveling snow away from the walls and reinforcing the stakes. The mules, still tethered in the clearing, stood with their backs to the wind, their coats thick with ice. Robert Duval brought them what feed he could, but the effort required wading through drifts that reached his thighs. By evening, the trail was buried under more than 2 feet of snow. The route to Elk Creek, which had seemed so straightforward 48 hours earlier, was now invisible and impassable. The window for evacuation had closed. The men of the Whitney survey, who had believed there was time, now understood that there was not, and had not been for quite some time. Dr. Moss's log entry for September 16th is brief and clinical. Storm worsening, trail impassable, party sheltering in place. No injuries. Morale strained but holding. Supplies adequate for 2 weeks minimum. Confidence that storm will clear soon. The final sentence, underlined in the original, suggests that even at this point, even after the realization that they were trapped, the group still believed the situation was temporary. That night, as the wind howled and the tents shuddered under the weight of the snow, Professor Whitney gathered the men around a single lantern and spoke to them calmly. He told them that the storm would pass, that they had enough food and fuel, and that their best course of action was to conserve energy, stay warm, and wait. He reminded them that they were experienced men, that they had faced difficult conditions before, and that panic was the only real danger. He said that when the snow stopped, they would leave immediately, and they would all reach Elk Creek safely. The men listened. Some believed him, some did not, but no one objected. There was nothing else to do. The snow fell for 3 more days. The first attempt to reach the Whitney survey party was launched on September 22, 1906, 6 days after the storm began, and 2 days after the expedition failed to arrive at the scheduled resupply point in Elk Creek. The alarm was raised by the teamster, contracted to transport supplies from the railroad, a man named Jacob Foss, who had been waiting at the Elk Creek camp since September 19th. When the survey party did not appear on the 20th, Foss assumed they had been delayed by weather. When they did not appear on the 21st, he rode to Orofino and notified the outfitting company that had organized the expedition's logistics. By the evening of the 22nd, a search party of 4 men, led by an experienced woodsman named Amos Kittredge, had been dispatched toward the upper Clearwater with instructions to locate the Whitney camp and assess the situation. Kittredge's party returned on September 25th, having reached a point approximately 9 miles northeast of Elk Creek before being forced to turn back. They reported that the trail was buried under 3 to 4 feet of snow, that the higher elevations were impassable without specialized equipment, and that any attempt to reach the Whitney camp in current conditions would require at least 12 men, pack animals capable of breaking trail, and several days of sustained effort. Kittredge estimated that the survey party, if still in their original camp, was at least 2 days' travel beyond the point where his group had been forced to stop. He recommended waiting for the snow to consolidate before attempting a full-scale rescue. The decision to delay the rescue effort was not made lightly. Telegrams were exchanged between Orofino, Lewiston, and Columbia University. Professor Whitney's colleagues in New York, alarmed by the reports of heavy snowfall in northern Idaho, urged immediate action. The outfitting company, concerned about liability, argued that a hasty rescue attempt could result in additional casualties. Local officials in Orofino, aware that the snow was unprecedented for mid-September, suggested waiting until early October, when temperatures would stabilize and the snow would either melt or harden sufficiently to allow travel. The final decision, made on September 27th, was to organize a well-equipped rescue party that would depart on October 1st, 2 weeks after the storm began. This delay, later criticized in newspaper accounts and in testimony before the university's Board of Trustees, was defended by those involved as the only realistic course of action. The region had no infrastructure for winter rescue operations. The nearest road accessible by wagon ended at Elk Creek. Beyond that point, all travel was on foot or by pack animal, through terrain that was difficult even under ideal conditions. The storm had deposited in some areas more than 5 feet of snow. Temperatures remained below freezing. And no one knew with certainty whether the Whitney party was still at their original camp, or whether they had attempted to evacuate and were now stranded somewhere along the trail. The rescue party that finally departed on October 1st consisted of 12 men, 16 mules, and sufficient supplies to sustain both the rescuers and the members of the Whitney survey for up to 2 weeks. They carried tents, medical equipment, food, blankets, and tools for digging through snow. The party was led by Benjamin Crail's brother, Joseph Crail, who knew the upper Clearwater as well as anyone in the region. The group made slow progress. The trail, where it could be found, was buried under drifts that required hours of labor to breach. In places, the snow had avalanched, sweeping away sections of the path entirely. The rescuers advanced an average of 4 miles per day. They reached the Whitney camp on the afternoon of October 7th, 22 days after the storm began. The camp was partially buried. 2 of the tents had collapsed under the weight of the snow. The others remained standing but were sagging and damaged. The clearing, once spacious and open, was now a shallow depression surrounded by snow-laden pines. The campfire pit was invisible. The supply tent had been crushed, and its contents, boxes of food, tools, equipment, were scattered across the site. There were no signs of life. Joseph Crail approached the first tent cautiously, called out and received no response. He opened the flap and found it empty. He moved to the second tent and found the same. The third tent, Professor Whitney's, contained a figure bundled in blankets, motionless. Crail called for the others. The figure did not respond. Crail entered, knelt beside the blankets, and pulled them back. Professor Whitney was alive. Over the next hour, the rescue party located all 11 members of the expedition. 6 were found in or near their tents, weak, frostbitten, and suffering from varying degrees of malnutrition and exposure, but alive. 5 were dead. The dead included Thomas Wyeth, one of the graduate assistants, Samuel Pruitt, one of the younger packers, Robert Duval, the camp assistant responsible for the stock, and 2 others whose identities were confirmed through personal effects and later through dental records. The causes of death, determined during the subsequent medical examination, were hypothermia, complications from frostbite, and in one case, pneumonia. The survivors were evacuated immediately. They were carried on improvised litters and transported to Elk Creek over the course of 4 days. From there, they were taken by wagon to the railroad at Lewiston and then by train to Spokane, where they were admitted to Sacred Heart Hospital. 3 of the 6 survivors required amputations due to severe frostbite. All suffered from malnutrition, dehydration, and psychological trauma. Professor Whitney, who had remained conscious throughout most of the ordeal, lapsed into delirium shortly after the rescue and did not regain full coherence for nearly a week. The recovered documents, journals, letters, notes, and official logs were transported to Columbia University, where they were archived and eventually made available to researchers. The documents provide a detailed, day-by-day account of the party's final 3 weeks. What they reveal is not a story of chaos or desperation, but of a slow, methodical disintegration. The snow stopped falling on September 19th. By that point, the depth around the camp exceeded 4 feet. The party's initial plan, to wait for the storm to pass and then evacuate, proved impossible to execute. The trail was gone. The landmarks were buried, and the physical condition of the men, after 3 days of cold and inadequate shelter, had deteriorated to the point where a forced march through deep snow was no longer feasible. Professor Whitney's journal entries from this period are measured and deliberate. On September 20th, he writes, "Storm has ceased. Snow depth prohibits travel. Decision made to remain in camp and await rescue. Sent 2 men, Crail and Gardner, to attempt descent to Elk Creek and summon help. Others will conserve energy and maintain camp." Benjamin Crail and Lewis Gardner departed the camp on the morning of September 21st, carrying minimal gear and a written message from Professor Whitney explaining the situation. They made it approximately 3 miles before Gardner collapsed from exhaustion. Crail helped him back to camp, arriving after nightfall. The attempt was not repeated. From that point forward, the party settled into a grim routine. Firewood was rationed. Food was rationed. The men took turns keeping watch, shoveling snow away from the tents and attempting to melt enough water for drinking. The mules, unable to forage and with limited feed remaining, were slaughtered one by one. The meat was preserved in the snow and consumed sparingly. The hides were used as additional insulation. Dr. Moss's medical log from late September documents the progression of frostbite, the onset of scurvy from lack of fresh food, and the gradual weakening of the group. On September 28th, he writes, "Wyeth unable to walk, Pruitt exhibiting signs of pneumonia, Duval unresponsive, remaining men weak but functional, Whitney coordinating rationing and morale. Belief persists that rescue is imminent." The belief in imminent rescue sustained the group for the first 10 days. By the end of September, however, that belief had begun to erode. The men understood that the storm had likely delayed any rescue attempt, and that help, if it came, might not arrive for weeks. The realization did not produce panic. It produced a kind of quiet resignation. The journals from this period are sparse, factual, and almost emotionless. The men recorded temperatures, snowfall, and the condition of supplies. They noted who was sick and who was not. They wrote letters they knew would not be sent. Thomas Wyeth died on October 2nd. His death was noted in Dr. Moss's log with a single line. Wyeth deceased at 4:10 a.m. exposure and respiratory failure. Samuel Pruitt died on October 4th. Robert Duval died on October 5th. The bodies were moved outside the tents and covered with snow. The survivors continued to wait. The rescue party arrived 2 days later. The investigation that followed was thorough and, by the standards of the time, comprehensive. Depositions were taken from all 6 survivors. The recovered documents were examined. The meteorological data were reviewed. The decision-making process that led the party to remain in camp on September 14th and 15th was scrutinized in detail. The final report, issued by a committee convened by Columbia University, concluded that no individual bore sole responsibility for the tragedy. The report noted that Professor Whitney had followed established protocols, that the weather advisory from Lewiston had been ambiguous, and that the storm itself was anomalous and unpredictable. The report recommended improvements to communication systems, better training for expedition leaders in meteorology, and the development of standardized evacuation procedures for field parties operating in remote areas. The families of the deceased filed no lawsuits. There were no criminal charges. The outfitting company in Orofino, though criticized in some quarters for the delay in launching the rescue, was not held liable. The event was classified as a tragedy, not a crime. Professor Whitney resigned from Columbia University in the spring of 1907 and never led another expedition. He lived until 1923, working intermittently as a consultant for mining companies and writing occasional papers on geology. He did not speak publicly about the events of September 1906, and his later journals, if they existed, were destroyed after his death. Benjamin Crail returned to work as a packer, but never again guided parties into the upper Clearwater. He moved to Oregon in 1910 and died in 1931. His brother Joseph, who led the rescue, continued working in the mountains until his retirement in 1925. When asked years later what he remembered most about the Whitney rescue, Joseph Crail said only, "They were still waiting when we found them. They thought we'd come sooner." Lewis Gardner, the photographer, recovered fully and resumed his work. His glass plates from the Whitney expedition, including the image of the group gathered around the fire on the evening of September 14th, were eventually donated to the Idaho State Historical Society. He never returned to the Clearwater. The 5 men who died were buried in their hometowns. Memorial services were held, obituaries were published, and within a few years, the story of the Whitney survey faded from public memory, remembered only by a few historians and by the families of those who had been there. The question that haunted the survivors, and that appears in various forms in their later testimony, was not why the storm came, but why they had not left sooner. The answer, of course, is that they believed there was time. They believed the storm would be manageable. They believed rescue would come quickly if needed. They believed that their preparations, their experience, and their caution would be sufficient. And they were wrong. Dr. Moss, in a letter written to Professor Whitney in 1908, summarized it this way: "We did everything one is supposed to do. We assessed the risk. We consulted the experts. We made a plan. And yet we failed, not because we acted rashly, but because we did not act rashly enough. The fault, if there is fault, lies not in our judgment, but in our assumption that judgment would be enough." The disappearance of the Whitney Geological Survey, or rather, the failure of the Whitney Survey to disappear, but instead to remain trapped in place, visible but unreachable, occupies an unusual position in the history of early 20th century exploration disasters. It was not dramatic. There was no single catastrophic decision, no moment of obvious recklessness, no villain to blame. The men did not die heroically. They did not die fighting. They died waiting, in tents that slowly filled with snow, for help that came too late. The story resists the narrative conventions we typically apply to such events. There is no hubris. There is no redemption. There is only a quiet, relentless accumulation of small delays that, in aggregate, proved fatal. The archival record of the Whitney survey is now housed in 3 locations: Columbia University, the Idaho State Historical Society, and the National Weather Service's Historical Meteorology Collection in Silver Spring, Maryland. The documents are well preserved, the journals are legible, the photographs are catalogued and digitized. Researchers can access the full record of the expedition with relative ease, and occasionally they do. Graduate students working on dissertations about progressive-era science, historians of the American West, meteorologists interested in anomalous weather events. But the story itself remains obscure. It does not appear in popular histories of exploration. It is not taught in schools. There is no monument, no plaque, no marker at the site of the camp. The Upper Clearwater Basin is now part of a designated wilderness area, accessible only by foot, and few people venture there. What the record shows, with uncomfortable clarity, is that the tragedy was preventable at multiple points, and that none of those points involved dramatic action. The party could have evacuated on the afternoon of September 14th, when the first telegram arrived. They could have left that evening or early on the morning of the 15th, or at any point before midnight. Each of these moments represented a choice, and each choice was defensible. The cumulative effect of the choices was catastrophic, but no single choice, examined in isolation, appears irrational. This is the aspect of the story that has made it difficult to narrate. There is no clear turning point. There is no moment when the men knowingly gambled and lost. Instead, there is a series of reasonable decisions, each made with incomplete information, each appearing sound at the time, and each moving the group incrementally closer to a situation from which there was no escape. The men were not reckless. They were cautious. And their caution, paradoxically, was part of the problem. They waited for confirmation that never came. They deferred action until the need for action became undeniable. And by the time the need was undeniable, action was no longer possible. The meteorological analysis conducted in the years following the event confirmed that the storm was extraordinary. The September 1906 snowfall in the northern Rockies exceeded in both intensity and duration any comparable event in the observational record for that region. The storm's forward speed, moisture content, and temperature profile were all outside the expected range for early autumn. The National Weather Service's retrospective report, published in 1911, classified the event as a 100-year occurrence, a storm that, statistically, should happen only once per century in that particular location. The implication was that the Whitney party had been unlucky, that they had encountered a weather event so rare that no amount of preparation could have anticipated it. But the unluckiness was not in encountering the storm. The unluckiness was in the timing. If the storm had arrived a day earlier, the party would have evacuated immediately. If it had arrived a day later, they would already have been gone. The margin, the window during which the storm's arrival coincided with the party's presence and their belief that departure could be delayed, was perhaps 12 hours. Within that 12-hour window, the men made a series of decisions that seemed at every moment to be the prudent ones, and they were wrong. Professor Whitney's final journal entry, written on October 6th, the day before the rescue party arrived, is brief and undated. It reads, "If anyone finds this, know that we acted in good faith. We believed we had time. We believed help would come. We were wrong about both. But we were not foolish. We were simply unlucky and perhaps too confident in our ability to wait." The phrase, "too confident in our ability to wait," captures something essential about the disaster. The men of the Whitney survey were experienced in endurance. They were accustomed to hardship, to cold, to isolation. They had spent weeks, sometimes months, in remote locations, and they had always emerged intact. Their training, their culture, and their self-conception all reinforced the idea that patience and discipline were virtues, that rash action was to be avoided, and that careful deliberation would yield better outcomes than panic. These principles had served them well in the past. In September 1906, they proved fatal. The question of whether the tragedy could have been avoided is, in one sense, unanswerable. With perfect foresight, yes, of course it could have been avoided. But the men did not have perfect foresight. They had experience, expertise, and reasonable expectations. They had a telegram that mentioned unsettled weather but did not specify snow. They had a packer who believed the trails would remain passable. They had a sky that remained clear until the last possible moment. They had every reason to believe that waiting was safe, and almost no reason to believe that it was not. The historical value of the Whitney Survey disaster lies not in its drama, but in its ordinariness. The event reveals the fragility of human judgment when confronted with systems, weather, terrain, time, that operate on scales and at speeds we cannot fully perceive. The men believed they were assessing risk rationally. They believed they were acting prudently, and they were, within the framework of their knowledge and experience. The problem was that the framework was incomplete, and the incompleteness was not apparent until it was too late. In this respect, the Whitney Survey belongs to a category of disasters that resist easy moral conclusions. There is no one to blame. There is no lesson that can be distilled into a simple maxim. The only takeaway, if there is one, is that margins are often narrower than they appear, that the time we believe we have is often less than we think, and that the cost of waiting, even cautious, deliberate waiting, can be higher than the cost of moving. The men who survived carried the memory of those 3 weeks for the rest of their lives. They did not speak of it often, and when they did, their accounts were measured and factual. They did not dramatize. They did not assign blame. They simply described what had happened. The snow, the cold, the gradual realization that help was not coming as quickly as they had hoped, and the slow passage of days in a camp that felt increasingly like a trap. Dr. Moss, in his final interview before his death in 1941, was asked if he had any regrets. He paused for a long time before answering. Then he said, "We should have left on the 14th. We knew that afterward. But at the time, leaving seemed premature. That's the thing. It always seems premature until it's too late. The upper Clearwater Basin is still there, much as it was in 1906. The river still runs clear in the late summer. The aspens still turn gold in the fall. The trails are unmarked but passable, if you know where to look. And on a broad terrace above the water, in a clearing surrounded by ponderosa pines, there is a place where 11 men once camped and waited and believed they had time.